Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon. Here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug. Strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
I'm Rod Bryant along with Jerry Gordon, and welcome to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio. What a great day it is to be alive, and a great day to do another show on the Kurds. We haven't talked about this in a while, have we, Jerry?
No, we haven't, and there have been a series of important developments in the hiatus, so to speak. But that's the reason we're bringing back one of the stars who knows what is happening and knows especially what's going down in Washington, D.C. That's Dilman Abdul Qadir. He's director of the Kurdistan Project at the Endowment for Middle East Truth. And the issues are stunning. There's a question about the U.S. support for protection of the Syrian Kurds. There's the question of whether or not the Europeans in particular are trying to find a way to get rid of the association with the Turks, perhaps to defend the Kurds, but we don't know that for a fact. And there's also a problem in Iraqi Kurdistan, with Iraq reaching out to Russia to buy the S-400 systems that could seriously threaten not only the U.S. in that vicinity, but Israel as well. Also,
we have the really complicated nature of the Iraqi government that by all intents and purposes is an Iranian extended government, and that's causing some problems for the Kurds as well. So we have a great show lined up for you. We're also going to be talking about what is the what's going on with this whole idea with NATO, or not NATO, the European countries wanting to start their own defense force, and how that's going to affect the big picture. So Jerry, do you have anything else you want to say before we go out of this segment?
Yeah, it's about time that the U.S. really put its marker down in terms of defense of the Kurds.
Right.
It's overdue, and that's what this program is all about.
It really is. And to get out of the whole old-school mentality of status quo in the State Department. So many bureaucrats running the show that keep making the same stupid decisions they've made for the last 65 years. We still see it today, and hopefully we can bring it up to a level to cause some people to think about it. Jerry?
And we got to stop having American diplomats kowtow to the Turks.
Right, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Okay, guys, don't go away. You listen to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
We really appreciate you guys showing up each week for Beyond the Matrix. I'm Rod Bryant, along with my amazing co-host, Jerry Gordon, and we have a guest that we've had on several times before. We just talked about him in the introduction of the show, Dilman Abdul Qadir, and we really appreciate you, Dilman, showing up again and talking about this very important subject. I know to you, especially to us, our listeners, and Jerry and I are both very interested in getting, I guess, the latest update. We haven't really talked about much about the Kurds in Syria for probably several weeks now, right, Jerry?
Yeah, at least that.
Yeah, so right now, how threatened is Kurdish control in Syria at this point?
Great. Thank you guys for having me back, by the way. A lot of developments have occurred since the last time we spoke. In Syria, as far as the Kurds, northeast Syria, I should say, is still under the constant threat. It's still under the constant threat coming from Turkey, and also what we've seen recently from the Assad regime as well, because his increase in pressure and lack of lack of urgency to take more of a diplomatic approach towards the Kurds in Syria have increased military operations in northwest Syria, and that's likely a sign towards the Kurds as well. But still the major threat coming from the Kurds in Syria and predominantly the Syrian Democratic Forces would be from our NATO partner Turkey, and this continues to be a threat in Manbij areas along the Euphrates River in the north, and also there's talks of safe zones, buffer zones. Of course, just an overview, we might get to it later. Afrin is still occupied by the Turks as well. So these are all dangerous territories, and the Kurds have reassured that the Americans, the SDF, composed of majority Kurds, but also Arabs, Armenians, Christians, are indigenous Syrians. These are local forces, so there's no necessary need for any other external military incursions.
Tillman, what's the status of the Trump withdrawal plan from Syria? How does it impact on the ability of the Syrian Democratic Force to defend Kurdish-controlled territory?
Right. So the status of the SDF and the Syrian Kurds regarding the President Trump's announcement back in December it's still a little scary, I would say. They're a little hesitant. They still don't know where the United States stands. But the scare has decreased since, largely because the president has taken back his position of fully withdrawing or immediately withdrawing U.S. troops from northeast Syria. And the announcement was basically taking out all the troops, the 2,200 troops. We do have 200 U.S. troops based in Al-Tanf near the Iraqi border inside Syria, and also the majority of the troops in northeast Syria. That number has fluctuated from anywhere from 200 to 1,000. Now the number is estimated to be anywhere from 400 to 700 troops in the long term as far as decreasing. But currently the situation is that there are still officially 2,200 U.S. troops based, and they have not withdrawn since December.
Recently, the U.S. Senate sponsored a Syria study group program, basically, and this report was finally finished. What were the findings relative to Trump withdrawal plan from Syria?
Right. So the Syria study group I believe, was implemented by by Senator Langford's office, and it is conducted by United States Institute for Peace, if I'm not mistaken. So basically, it's a study group. So it's a policy recommendation for the U.S. Congress and eventually for the administration as well. What it found was that what we already know for the most part is that the United States needs to continue to keep a presence in Syria, to continue to keep pressure on the Islamic State. So we do know that the caliphate is defeated. However, there are still over 20,000 ISIS fighters across Syria and Iraq, which are currently in a sleeper cells. So they come in and attack, and they attack the rural areas, the desert areas, the smaller villages. And what also stated that they supported Israel's right to defend itself through air campaign. They stated that Iran is a destabilizing force. It is there for the long term, and the United States needs to be there in order to continue basically the pressure of the maximizing pressure campaign that the administration has put forward. What is interesting, I would like to add, is that this Syria Studies report actually included the situation in Afrin, and which is not mostly talked about now that Turkey has occupied it since 2018. But it also said that the Turks aren't willing to negotiate on Afrin. Turkey has built walls around Afrin, concrete walls. And also what the most interesting part, as from a Kurdish perspective, is that it stated that the best approach, obviously, between the SDF and Turkey is a diplomatic approach, but the long-term approach is Turkey conducting peace talks with the PKK inside Turkey. So that's very rare coming from the U.S. perspective, because it just signals to the Turks that the United States is taking the PKK seriously, that the United States realizes that that Turkey must have peace with the PKK in order for them to have peace with the Kurds in Syria.
This past week, 400 members of the House and Senate signed a letter to the Trump White House regarding this very same Syrian policy. What were their recommendations?
Right. So when you have a letter that includes 400, it'll likely be watered down to make everybody happy. Obviously, it is 400 members of the House and Senate. But overall, it reiterated that we need to continue from the United States perspective, continue pressure on the Islamic State, the enduring defeat of the Islamic State. That's number one. Number two is that they support the right for Israel to continue its campaign, its air campaign. Israel is considered the fifth external country that's involved in Syria. And also, its third point is Hezbollah, which has major militia on the ground, is to basically defeat them on the ground as well and continue the pressure on Hezbollah militias on the ground. And Hezbollah militias have been weakened a little bit because of the pressure, over the civil war, the 9-year-long civil war.
Now, obviously, there is quite a bit of bipartisan support in Congress for this, but how is it balanced out? Is it more the conservatives are for this, or is it a pretty balanced bipartisan support?
So regarding keeping troops in Syria, I would say it's bipartisan. Regarding different aspects of the issue have bipartisan. Some are more Democrats, some are more Republican. So regarding everyone understands that we need to keep troops inside Syria. I think this is the best thing that the president has done, actually, is to bring, after his announcement in December, that he brought both sides together, which was surprising, but it worked. And that's very rare on the Hill. Second, I would say that regarding Turkey, there is a little hesitancy from the Democratic side because they are a NATO ally. The Republicans do understand it, I would say, a little bit better, that Turkey, yes, it is a NATO ally. We do want to preserve that relationship, but we also understand that we have to look out for the United States security interests, and we cannot abandon our allies, the Kurds.
Speaking of Turkey, Trump's special envoy on Syria and Turkey, James Jeffrey, testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. What did he offer in the way of administration policies protecting Syrian Kurdish interests?
The James Jeffrey, I would say, reiterated some of the points made by Secretary Pompeo, John Bolton, even the president, and saying that we're here to protect, we're eventually going to withdraw our troops. For the time being, we haven't decreased that number. We do want to decrease it to anywhere from, one of the members of Congress mentioned 400 to 1,000 troops. That is the eventual goal. He also stated that the 200 troops in Al-Tanf border weren't going to be affected in southern Syria. So that number that number is 400 to 1,000 troops will be mainly focused on northeast Syria. Regarding the Syrian Kurds, they do believe that we need to protect our allies, but they are also taking Turkey's security concerns into consideration. That could be good and bad for the Kurds. Obviously, he did discuss the safe zone, a possibility where Turkey wants to put its military presence inside northeast Syria in a 25 to 30 kilometer safe zone inside the north. However, the Kurds are against this. We do know that, but the American stance is currently that they cannot accept 30 kilometers, and if they do decide on a number as far as depth into Syria, that would include local forces. Now, what was confusing about that is the SDF are local forces, which is composed of the YPG and YPJ. They are local forces, but it seemed to me as if Ambassador James Jeffrey wanted other local forces besides the Kurds in sharing this safe zone. The Kurds feel majority of their population is based in the north, so they should have troops there as well, along with the Turks and Americans.
When we come back from the break, I would like to pick it up and ask you about the rest of the support from the NATO countries, UK, France, Germany, etc. But I also would like to chat a moment, as soon as we come back from the break, about the general level of safety for the Kurdish people in the region? Are they still having to deal with a tremendous amount of terrorism and attacks and destruction in their farmlands and et cetera? So when we come back, I'd like to address that. Dilman, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to go to a short break. We want to remind you that we're sponsored by Torah Learning Channel. Torah Learning Channel is found at TorahLearningChannel.com. You will greatly appreciate watching that each week to enjoy your studies of Torah. We'll be right back after these messages here on Israel News Talk Radio.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
We told you we'd be right back, and we made it. You're listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio. We've been talking to Dilman Abdul Qadir, and we're talking specifically about Syria. Before we went to the break, I had asked what was the general level of safety or security for the Kurdish people. I'd like to get that answered first, and then I have a follow-up with that.
Right. So the security of the Kurdish people continues to be at risk. Largely, there are ISIS sleeper cells in rural villages, which pose a threat. And we've seen this also largely it's heated up, not in Syria particularly, but also in Iraqi Kurdistan, near the Iraqi KRG border in Kirkuk, for example, in the deserts of Kirkuk, where ISIS have attempted to burn Kurdish crops, Kurdish farmers, their villages, and if they don't pay taxes, if they don't give their wheat and whatnot, their collection of food, they would have their lives threatened, for example. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, what's happening in Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq is similarly happening in Syrian Kurdistan as well. So, and then obviously the bigger threats with the mercenaries and the Assad regime continues to threaten the SDF stability and the hold on northeast Syria, which is about 30% of the territory.
What seems to be fairly encouraging to me is that the House and Senate and Congress signing the letter showing bipartisan support for the Kurds, that we're slowly approaching a period of time where we can get some stability. If the United States continues to provide logistical, intelligence and support to knock out or to kill or capture these ISIS leaders, it's just a matter of time, if we stay consistent, that things could quiet down. What do you think?
I agree, but the constant threat of U.S. withdrawal hovers over the feeling of individual security at a local level, and also as the Syrian Democratic Council at a government level, and its military wing, the SDF. So it may be stable for now. It has been stable since the defeat of the Caliphate. However, this can all unravel as soon as the U.S. withdraws, or even the U.S. shows any signs of weakening as far as pulling out troops and pulling out intelligence and military sharing, and that includes not just the U.S., the 79-member global coalition, which includes European members.
Gentlemen, what's the current position of the UK, France, and Germany on protection of Syrian Kurdistan? And we also understand that two of these countries, France and Germany, are proposing an EU army. How does that impact on the situation for Syrian Kurds?
Right. So to answer your first question, France has been the most vocal in supporting the Kurds and keeping their troops on the ground, and in accordance with the United States, in coordination with the U.S., especially after the loss of the 4 American service members back in December after the president announced his withdrawal. France, President Macron did state that he wants to keep troops for over a year longer. So it's been it's in the process of that. But As far as the UK and Germany as well, I think they will like to stay in Syria long term, as long as the United States can reassure them that they will stay there as well, especially with the air protection, because none of these countries, even put together, have the tools or the capabilities as the United States does. And it needs to happen in an alliance, in a unity fashion, because if, for example, if the U.S. withdraws, France doesn't have much leverage alone. And as far as the EU army talk, this may be good and bad. It may look bad for the United States. I'm not sure the U.S.'s position on this. I think the United States is for preserving the status quo, which is NATO, and its intent of creation, which is basically keeping the old Soviet bloc away, and also Russia today. So, but I think the EU's intention is to create a more independent military security bloc away from NATO obligations, such as the 2% GDP requirements, which they've been facing a lot of pressure from the administration. And also, I would say, uncontrollable actors, state actors, such as Turkey, because most of these European members are part of the NATO, and so is Turkey. There's no mechanism within NATO to eject a NATO partner or even suspend a NATO partner. So I think this would be an opportunity for the EU to have an exclusive military security bloc similar to their economic bloc that would leave Turkey out of it. And where Erdogan's heading, I don't think this is a surprise.
Last week a week or so ago, there was a series of bombings which really created a mess in Manbij. Who's behind this?
Right. The bombings we're seeing is now Manbij. We have to remember it's along the border of the Euphrates River, and across the river is controlled by the Turks and their proxies. And the other side of the river, where actual Manbij is controlled by the Manbij Military Council, which is majority Arab forces. They may have Kurdish-led generals, but it's a Manbij because Manbij is a Arab city, and also you have American presence there. So the threat continues, and the bombings occur after countless speeches, I would say, from Erdogan himself, saying that prepare for war. We're going into northeast Syria, and we saw this rhetoric increase, especially during local elections in Turkey. And I think this has hyped up the intention to militarily occupy Manbij and cross the river into northeast Syria, in which Erdogan has continued to threaten to go in with the Russians' blessings. So
you're saying that Turkey's actually directing this stuff?
I think to a certain degree, indirectly, okay. Turkey is giving orders, and if it's not Turkey, this is even more dangerous because these are uncontrolled non-state actors, which can risk a broader and bigger conflict that in that area, because it involves major actors such as the United States, such as the locals, and also the Syrians and even the Turks.
Tillman, what's been the record of human rights violations under Turkish occupation in Afrin that we talked about during the first segment?
Right, so Afrin continues to be occupied by the Turks. They took it over in Operation Olive Branch, they named it, ironically, and that's been under their control since 2018. The human rights violations have been, it's a long list, and it continues to be. We see Afrin, a major 95% majority Kurdish city, has become less than 40% Kurdish city. This is demographic change in 2019. This is out in the open. This is a Western partner. This is a NATO ally that is Turkifying and Islamifying a very secular and very stable, which was very stable part of Syria. It was never touched by ISIS. It was never attacked by the Assad regime, largely because it was considered a safe haven even for IDPs and refugees. Now you have civilians continuing to, they still flee the area, and those that remain are pressured by the Turkish factions, the Al-Qaeda affiliates, the FSA, the so-called opposition, to basically Turkify them, change their culture, change their language, change their education system, their books. Now you have Turkish flags flying everywhere. This was supposed to be a Syrian revolution, not a Turkish one.
Why are the Kurds, Arabs, and Christians in the northeast of Syria opposing Erdogan's demand to build a safe zone?
So this relates to the Afrin issue that we just discussed, because we know Erdogan's intent. We witnessed Erdogan's slaughter against the Kurds and against the civilians, against the IDPs. We know what Erdogan is capable of. So what he did in Afrin, which is to occupy that area in northwest Syria, and then now build a concrete wall around it with an intention eventually to annex it as part of Turkish territory.
It would be
know this is the intent with northeast Syria.
Yeah, it'd be like handing it over to him then.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And this is unacceptable because, first of all, that area is stable, so there's no reason for Turkish military incursion in that part of the country. And it's already, these are safe havens for IDPs and refugees that are doing just fine with the American presence there. And Turkey would just attempt to duplicate what they did in Afrin in northeast Syria.
I tell you, it feels like the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, because it's just like every way you turn, there is no winning in this situation. It just seems so complex. With that being said, we had mentioned several months ago about this huge group of detained ISIS fighters and family members who are being held in a refugees camp. What's their status on them? What do they plan on doing with them?
Right. So the status of ISIS detainees are still, I think James Jeffrey, actually, Ambassador James Jeffrey mentioned this today. He stated that the Syrian Democratic Forces have done a great job, in his own words, of holding on to these ISIS detainees, and that the families are a little more complex than the actual fighters. The families are still being held at refugee camps, but again, they need international support, especially from the United Nations, because they can't do it alone. They don't have the capacity to hold all these ISIS families together. As far as the fighters, there's still an estimated 3 to 5, and I've heard numbers up to 10,000 today from some of the lawmakers, that they're being held in northeast Syria. And the scary aspect of this is no international or external country where these ISIS fighters are from are willing to take them back.
Yeah,
so they're stuck in Syria. So what I would add to that is that's okay. If these countries don't want to take them back, I would say give an incentive for the SDF and the Kurds to keep them there, such as continued support as far as military support, and also continued presence, keeping your forces there. I think that would be the best solution, because right now there's held in makeshift prisoners.
Right. It's a terrible situation for anybody to be held in that situation, in that type of a refugee camp, but we'll deal with that in a moment. We have to go to a break, guys. Don't go away. You listen to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
And we are in the last segment of the show. I can't believe time passes so fast when you're having fun. Dillerman, we thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. It's been a great interview so far. You're about to publish an article in the national interest regarding the Iraqi Kurdistan position caught in the U.S. confrontation with Iran. So what is your principal conclusion, and what are some of the findings?
Right. My ultimate conclusion is that the United States has to learn from its previous lessons regarding the Kurds, essentially that we cannot abandon them. Because when conflicts like this do arise, the Kurds do come in handy. They are no matter where, Syria, whether it be Iran or even the Iraqi Kurds, that we will eventually need them. And where the Iraqi Kurds control the Kurdistan regional government, it is the most stable part of Iraq. Now, with that said, the United States, the Kurds still have a resentment towards the U.S., especially since 2017 when they held the referendum, the independence referendum, which the United States did not back them. They felt abandoned, and this feeling still occurs, and rightly so. However, the United States, and they would be a little more hesitant, I would say, in outright supporting the United States, because they will have to think about their stability, and also that the reality is that Iran is their neighbor. So if the U.S. is demanding full support from the Iraqi Kurds, I think it would be a little difficult. And also, since 2017, a lot has developed within the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government. Iran has built deep roots within the major political parties, both in Sulaymaniyah, in Erbil, in Duhok, with the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the Barzani-led government, and also the Talabani Party, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, or the PUK. So it's not as easy as we may think it be that, okay, these guys are Kurds, they're going to support America. Of course, they would like that. But will they have the guarantee of continued American support 10 years from now?
Dillman, there is concern about the Iraqi Shia militia, the Hashd al-Shabi, the Popular Mobilization Units, because they could be assets of Iran in Iraq that might attempt actions against, for example, the U.S. air base at Al-Sad. Right. What threats do they pose to, for example, the KRG?
Right. And this goes back to the fight against ISIS and the referendum as well. The Hashd al-Shabi was actually legalized under Iraqi constitution by former Prime Minister Abadi. This was a dangerous move, I think, in my opinion, and many of the Kurds in the Kurdistan Regional Government reiterated that they cannot be legalized because this is a Shiite force that is deeply funded by the Iranian regime. We know they get their support. We know they get their weapons from, and they're even using, you mentioned threats against U.S. forces in Al-Assad, they're using U.S. Humvees, U.S. weaponry. And it was these same forces that took over Kirkuk in October 17th in 2017, using U.S. Humvees, U.S. forces, and while they were stepping on U.S. flags. So this is I would say this is biting the U.S. in the back now. This is the reality that we created when we decided not to back the Kurdistan Regional Government in the referendum. Instead, we backed Baghdad and Abadi. We thought he was going to win. He ended up losing. We have a new government that's more inclusive, but still the Hashd al-Shabi are very much independent from the main Iraqi security forces, and also the Hashd al-Shabi is Shia-led. So it also isolates the Sunni population as well.
Aren't there members of the Hashd al-Shabi in the Baghdad parliament who were in fact identified as terrorists during, for example, the Second Gulf War? Right.
There are many members of Hashd al-Shabi that are U.S. designated entities and individuals. Some of their leadership is actually Iranian, and some have been to Iran. So, I mean, what can I say about this is that this is a creation that happened before the United States. Unfortunately, that's why the United States has to have realistic policy towards Iraq and not the status quo. This is the result of a status quo policy of keeping Iraq together when the reality is that it's very much influenced by Iran. And Iran is heavily influencing. If there was a conflict between the United States and Iran, I think the Hashd al-Shabi would be on the Iranian side.
No doubt. I mean, no doubt. I'm shaking my head in absolute disgust because it is something that this country has created. The previous administration seemingly went out of its way to make a mess. I realized that they were operating on ideology and on whatever dreams and visions they thought was the correct mode, but they created such a mess when we pulled out and pulled our influence out of the region. And now we just, all we can do now is just kind of keep the top on it and keep it from exploding again.
Exactly. And I would say, it all began with the 2011 withdrawal under the previous administration. And this is the result of it. We gave too much power to Maliki, the former Shiite prime minister, which basically went on a revenge campaign against the Sunni population in Iraq, which is about 20%, and also the Kurds. Gave all the weapons, all the funding to the Shiites, and then later we have the creation of the ISIS, and then the rising of the Shiite militias, which a lot of people don't see much difference between the Islamic State and the Shiite militias.
No, exactly. Jerry?
Tillman was the architect of this debacle that occurred in October 2017, none other than the former special envoy to defeat ISIS, Brett McGurk.
So Brett McGurk is an interesting individual. Now, he is not very much liked in Iraqi Kurdistan, but he is very much liked in Syrian Kurdistan. Why? Because he was an advocate to keeping the U.S. troops there, continuing to protect the Syrian Kurds because he was on the ground with them constantly. He understood the Turkish, why Turkey is acting more of an adversary than an ally, and he continues to do that. Now, however, in Iraqi Kurdistan, it's a different story. They feel that Brett McGurk betrayed the Kurds. He went against his promises. He was not there for them during the referendum, and he backed that. So he plays an interesting role as far as he has much more success in Syria, I would say, than Iraq. This is the creation again of the old State Department types. Unfortunately, that doesn't always apply a realistic, necessary policy towards Iraq.
When you talk about the old school mentality of the State Department, I don't know how we can ever avoid that. I mean, if you go back in history and you look at how we made decisions going all the way back to Korea and Vietnam, for example, that created a tremendous amount of turmoil. It just seems like we'd never, as a country, have learned from our mistakes. It seems that we repeat the same kind of stupidity, and I'm not sure why that happens. Is it because we are hiring people in that are just bureaucrats, or we have real visionaries and thinkers? And sometimes I think that those two don't even exist in the same world. That's what it seems to me. It's my opinion. You take $5 and go buy your hamburger.
It's this is the most difficult part of my job, I'd say, is dealing with these issues as far as facing where the State Department stands.
Right.
And that's a status quo policy. I cannot emphasize more. We have to get away from, the United States has to have a more modern and realistic approach towards the Middle East. Just to add on to this, a last point. Iraq, this country that we've invested billions of dollars and since 2003, even afterwards, in training and equipment and even American lives, is in the talks of purchasing Russian S-400 missiles. This is dangerous. What does this mean? Is that Turkey is purchasing Russian S-400 missiles. Syria has S-300 missiles. Iran has S-300, and I believe they have S-400 missiles, and Iraq now. So this is the air defense system posed by Russia across the Middle East. So yes, we're talking about Shiite crescent, but we have to look out where Russia's strategy is, and the United States nowhere to be found. And this also, I can add one more point to that, is we see Russia, Iran, and Turkey carving up the Middle East, carving up Syria as they've met in Astana. Again, we see the United States is nowhere to be seen.
Jerry, you have something.
Dillman, speaking about the S-400 threat, and we had a good friend of ours that we interviewed this past week that'll air today who will amplify what you just talked about. But the problems there extend well beyond the question of Iraq and Syria. because essentially if the Iraqi regime acquired the S-400, that would mean that Israel's ability to interdict Iranian and Iranian-backed proxies, for example, in Syria would be seriously curtailed.
Definitely. Israel would have a lesser chance of defending its sovereign territory. And my response to that is, if the Iraqis, now their stance currently is between the Iranian-U.S. tension is that they want to play neutral. Now, I don't think Iraq has the capability of being a neutral partner or even a mediator. They may be a messenger, but not a mediator, largely because majority of the government is Iranian influence. Now, I would say my opinion on this is that it may not be realistic. However, the United States should consider providing Patriot missiles to the Kurdistan Regional Government in opposition to Baghdad's S-400 missile purchase.
Absolutely. Dylan, we're going to have to go. We're at the end here. How can, what is the name of the website that people can go to and read more information about your research and what you're doing?
Yes, definitely. So my personal website is dabdulkader.com, and this is where I post all my latest articles, interviews, and research on there, too. So it's very accessible, and also on Twitter, too.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. It's been great visiting with you. We'll talk to you next week at the same time here on Beyond the Matrix on Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.